As much as you prepare yourself and you think you're ready, nothing prepares you for getting the news. It was a kick in the gut. But Mama didn't know. So here I was, closing down my practice, retiring. How do you tell Mama? If it's Sunday afternoon and it's fair weather, there's a pool party. I was born in a little town in eastern North Carolina, Everett's, 240 souls, more or less. 1940, only child. Dad was a tobacco farmer. After high school, I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and went on there to the medical school, and after medical school and internship to Philadelphia to do my psychiatric residency. Did 2 years in the Navy, which took me to Vietnam and Okinawa, and then San Francisco for the second year. I ended up in Nashville, Tennessee, where I was on the faculty at Vanderbilt. I ran the psychiatric inpatient unit at Vanderbilt. And while I was in Nashville is when I came out. So I was a late bloomer. Came to Atlanta in 1976. Regarding the coming out, when you start meeting your patients, coming out of a gay bar as you're going in, it's time to get out of Dodge. So the natural place to come was to Atlanta. My dad's advice was get a licensed profession, which to me meant law or medicine. I was kind of an awkward kid growing up, but the one thing I could do was make good grades. So when I went to UNC, I enrolled in pre-med. The pre-med courses were more and more difficult, so if I didn't make it there, I could switch over to law and do something else. But like I said, I made good grades and sailed in. In fact, I got into medical school after 3 years. I had no clue about being a doctor. Wasn't anybody in my family doctors. I had no idea at all what I was getting myself into. It was only in my second or third year when I started getting into clinical rotations and started encountering blood and guts and death and dying that I had sort of a bit of a crisis. That wasn't what I signed up for. So I had to do some searching as to what I wanted to do, and talking to people or listening to people, whichever you want to call it, was something that I do very well. So psychiatry seemed like a good fit. Besides, it was nice, clean medical specialty. Didn't have to deal with all that death and dying stuff. So I went to psychiatry. I went to University of Pennsylvania. I was their token Southerner. And while I was there, I was married, very briefly. She ran off with a social worker. And it was after Philadelphia that I ended up, I'd already signed up in the Navy because you had to get a education deferment in those days. And I let them know I needed to get out of Philadelphia. Well, we've got just the place for you. Less than 30 days later, I stepped off the plane in Da Nang. I was assigned as a psychiatrist to the 3rd Marine Division in Quang Tri, Vietnam. Banner year, 1969. I was only there for 3 or 4 months. Nixon was in the process of bringing troops out of Vietnam. The 3rd Marines were the first to go in, so they were the first to come out. And we during Thanksgiving of '69, we redeployed to Okinawa. Normally, Okinawa would be the armpit of the Pacific, but considering where I was coming from, it was an island paradise. So I was there for the remainder of my tour, got to do some traveling in the Far East. And after you have done time in Vietnam, you can picture your duty station, so San Francisco seemed like the ideal place to me. It was interesting, while I was there, I didn't know about Castro Street, was struggling with coming out issues, but there was lots more I had to learn about before I could come out. Growing up, I knew I was different, but I didn't even have a name for it. I didn't know anybody else and gay was something that wasn't even a concept for me. It was interesting, while we were in my psychiatric training, my professors had said, you're going to learn most from the patients that you see, so don't be afraid to ask them questions if there are things about their life experience that you would like to know. Well, during my second year, I had a young man from South Philadelphia who was a practicing homosexual. And I grilled him about all sorts of details. I was too afraid to try to do much while I was in the military, certainly while I was in Vietnam and Okinawa. I began to do a little bit of play-in when I was in San Francisco. But that, even when I moved to Nashville, I was still dating some until finally I couldn't play both sides of the street, and so that's where I actually came out, was when I was living in Nashville. I had one boyfriend in Nashville. His name was Dale. It didn't last a long time. He wasn't a live-in, and I was too much of a neophyte to really be into much in the way of a relationship. I was just discovering my sexuality. I'd found a new toy, and I was looking to play. Met friends there that introduced me to Atlanta, the bathhouses in Atlanta, the clubs here. And so when I realized it was time to make a move, there wasn't really any choice about where to go. Atlanta was my only choice. Besides, Nashville was on the wrong side of the mountains, and but I certainly wanted to stay in the South, and so Atlanta was a natural choice. I was out when I was in Nashville, but I really came out when I came to Atlanta. When I made my remarks at the HRC in 2003, I opened by saying I came to Atlanta to learn how to be queer.
What an incredible journey this has been. When I moved to Atlanta in 1976, I certainly had no idea of being a community leader. No, indeed, I was moving to the big city to learn how to be queer. And for the next 6 to 8 years, that's exactly what I did.
I was quite fortunate. I found a large psychiatric group that I joined. I was their token gay boy. Offices were out in Smyrna. I lived here in town. I had my professional life out there. I had my social life here. In fact, the first several years I was here, I did a lot of entertaining. I gave a big Christmas party. On Friday night, I would have a big party for the professional folks, and the next night, we did the same thing with all my gay folks, and then we charged it all off as one party as a tax deduction. But I was able to maintain that kind of separation between personal and professional life. By being in a large group, I also had much more personal time. I was on call about once a week, one weekend out of the month, and for a doctor, that's a damn good schedule. I wasn't particularly involved in any kind of organizations. I had a circle of friends. I liked to entertain. I liked to party. I had a partner from 1978 until 1980, but that was my first really long-term relationship, if you call 2 years long-term. And then it was in the fall of '82 that I met John. We were together for 10 years. After I had been in Atlanta for a while, I wanted to try to develop more of a gay clientele. At the time, my office was out in Smyrna, and that can be an impediment for some fellows going into Cobb County. We had several offices scattered around Metro. We had at one point 15, 16 psychiatrists in our group, so we had 3 or 4 different office locations. I opted to move my office into downtown. That would be closer to the clientele I wanted to cultivate. I started advertising in the gay newspapers. In Southern Voice, etc. was the bar rag at that point, and I started developing a significant gay clientele. Careful what you ask for. By the early '80s, about a third of my practice were gay men. My practice had always been very heavily weighted to doing hospital inpatient work. The kind of psychiatry I practice is you don't even do today because hospital benefits are so limited. But so I saw a lot of hospitalized patients, but my outpatient clientele, about a third of them were gay men. I did consultations at Piedmont, West Paces Ferry, some of the other hospitals we covered. Those are the 2 primary ones I saw. And I began to get consultations to see young gay men who were sick. That was at the same time when I began to see clients in the office who were worried about friends who were getting sick or friends who had died. The first rumblings of the AIDS epidemic. I really felt there was something missing in my life. I'd been raised as a Southern Baptist, a little Baptist church up in North Carolina. My mother was pianist there for 60 years, a good old Southern Baptist saint. And I just put all of that to the back burner. After Ed, my first partner, and I got together, we looked around for a church. And as fate would have it, we found Northside Drive Baptist Church, a very affirming, very accepting, very un-Southern Baptist church. The minister was Tom Conley, was very accepting of me and Ed. He and his wife were over here on numerous occasions for dinner. When I first found this place, Northside Drive was the church where Jimmy Carter attended when he was governor. In fact, there's a peanut in one of the stained glass windows signifying that. When I found this place, this very, very high church, I met with Tom over at 103 West. We had a couple of drinks. And I laid out the whole story for him. I wanted to be a part there, but I wanted it to be understood. I had a partner. We don't have any room for intolerance or prejudice in our congregation. So I'd found a spiritual home. I began to see young men who were sick and dying. A lot of these boys were Southern Baptist boys from little rural churches just like I was. They needed a minister more than they needed a psychiatrist. Mama didn't even know if they were gay, much less they were dying of AIDS. So I started contacting my minister and asked Tom to see some of these fellows with me. And he did. He would see folks at West Paces, at Piedmont. That was during the days when you had to put on a cap and gown and a mask to go in. You couldn't touch anybody. It was like having a spacesuit on. That was also the time when occasionally you'd see a meal sitting out in the hallway because the staff was too afraid to take it into the room. People were very frightened. There was something going on that nobody knew what was causing it, and people were scared. I was reading what was available in the medical press about what was going on, and so I was as informed as any physician could be. But we still didn't have the virus hadn't been discovered. The patients I saw were guys were frightened. Their friends were getting sick. People were beginning to die. This sounds, I'm ashamed to even admit it today, but I wasn't one of those that was going to be carrying signs and marching in the streets. I had a bit of disdain. I suppose that was a part of being closeted, if you will. I don't remember when I went to my first gay pride. It was well into the 80s before I did. I was wanting to get involved in the community, but I wasn't quite sure how to do that. I thought the Gay Center would be a place that I could get involved, and I met several times with Bill Grip, who was running the Gay Center at that time. But it became clear to me pretty quickly that they didn't have any interest in having me involved. The whole story of the Gay Center is a very sad and tragic one, but I didn't find any welcome there. Early 1984, Gay and Lesbian Health Conference was held at Emory. And John and I went. It was Easter weekend, as a matter of fact. And while I was there, I met Caitlin Ryan. She was the executive director of Aid Atlanta. And since I'd had no luck at getting in at the Gay Center, I thought that perhaps Aid Atlanta might be a place where my talents might be useful. She was very excited about meeting me, and we were going to schedule an appointment within the next couple of weeks. John and I already had a vacation planned to San Francisco, so it was going to occur after that. It was interesting what happened on that vacation. I had a dear friend that we visited with regularly out there, and while I was in Lee's apartment, he was telling me about this wonderful organization he was involved in called Shanti. Shanti in San Francisco was the equivalent of Aid Atlanta here. And he was beginning to volunteer there, and he was excited about it. And Jesse Peel, I want you to go back to Atlanta and do the same thing there. While we were talking, there was a knock on the door, and it was a Shanti volunteer, recruiting volunteers and donations. Well, they already had Lee. They got a donation from me, and I said, "Okay, I get it already." At that point, the The Aid Atlanta office was over on Piedmont, right near where Fat Max is now. They had one room up on the second floor there. The board was meeting every week. The first board meeting I went to, there was about a 30-minute discussion as to whether to buy or to lease a typewriter. They had a $60,000 a year budget and 1.5 employees. I suggested to John that we needed to do something to maybe do a fundraiser. I'd never done any fundraiser before, but I'd done a lot of entertaining. I had quite an extensive guest list. I contacted a couple of friends of mine who also had extensive guest lists. We put them together, and I invited them, sent out, I guess, 150, 200 invitations to a pool party, poolside. But the novel idea was we were going to charge admission. Doesn't seem particularly novel now, but it was then. I had my friends Chip and Fred from up in Nashville. They were big into club music. They had a big DJ setup. They brought their traveling DJ show to out here. We set up out by the pool, and on a Saturday afternoon we raised almost $6,000. It was a very exciting time at Aid Atlanta at that point. It was all volunteer driven. We had at Aid Atlanta, we recognized that a very important part of treatment was spiritual support. We were dealing with people that were going to die. AIDS was a death sentence at that point. So Aid Atlanta had a pastoral care department. You couldn't get funding for it. But we did have a number of congregations in the community that were supported. We worked hard on recruiting a diverse board membership. I brought in Dr. Ron White was my physician at the time. I brought him on the board of Aid Atlanta. About that same time, Bruce Garner came onto the board. I had not known Bruce previously. We realized that at Aid Atlanta that we needed some kind of community task force on AIDS. We approached Fulton County. We approached the mayor of Atlanta. We didn't really get anywhere. We had there was all sorts of legislation that was being proposed down at the Capitol. The gay doctors in the community organized, and GAFR was formed, Georgia Association Physicians for Human Rights. We could always supply a physician to testify down at the Capitol on a moment's notice. And we identified friends in the legislature that we could count on, that we could work with. And we managed to keep out most of the more onerous legislation that was proposed. At some point, I don't remember what the years were, Sandy Thurman was the executive director at Aid Atlanta. The legislature would be in session, and Sandy would put on a very stylish black dress, single strand of pearls, and go down, and she would have those good old boys eaten out of her hand. She was our secret weapon. A beautiful, blonde, straight woman speaking as our advocate. There were so many people that were involved in those early years as the organizations developed. Aid Atlanta grew up and developed into a real agency. You have to understand that there were no services available for people with AIDS. There were no organizations that were really providing the kinds of services that our folks needed. This was also the time when preachers were railing from the pulpits that AIDS was God's retribution. I never did figure out what God had against hemophiliacs and Haitians, but that was what they were saying. Organizations were formed as the need arose. Early along, we embarked on a safe sex campaign. Our first safe sex campaign at Aid Atlanta, with the motto "P.S. I Love You," was born right here on this living room floor. None of us had any experience with nonprofit organizations, but we knew how to throw a party. So there began to be black tie galas. Mardi Gras became Masquerade, a benefit from Project Open Hand. Positive Impact developed Casino Night. We were bringing to the table the skills that we had. And as far as boards were concerned, you'd get doctors to serve if they would. You'd find a lawyer. You always needed a CPA or an accountant. You had to have a bean counter involved. There were no state or federal funds available yet. There still was no treatment. The virus was discovered. There was the test. And then some things began to happen in society. Rock Hudson finally came out at the 11th hour, but it certainly made the awareness of AIDS much more prevalent. Princess Di picking up AIDS babies did more than you can imagine to give the message to people that this ain't something that's easy to catch. DHR realized they needed a public forum. There were really good people there. Jim Alley was a DHR commissioner. He was a great fellow. They understood. But in state government, bureaucrats have some limitation on how much initiative they can take. It's just the way government runs. They needed a group of outside experts to be able to make recommendations. We got word that DHR was wanting to create a state task force. Well, we already had the roster of people that had agreed to serve, but we couldn't get anybody to convene it. So we got together with DHR, we presented our list, and almost everybody that we had proposed was on the list, plus they expanded it because it was a state task force. And the State Task Force on AIDS was created. We met once a month for a number of years. And we didn't have any power, didn't have any authority, but we could serve as a lightning rod. We could make the proposal, and DHR can say, well, this is the recommendation of the State Task Force. They're the experts. Provided cover for them. It provided a public forum where issues could be discussed and thrashed out, and it was a very heady time. I got to meet people from all over the state. Bruce Garner served on that task force with me. I served on it the entire time it was in existence. I wanted to be sure that the gay community was represented, and I wanted to be sure that the positive affected community was represented. There had to be some watchdogs there to keep them honest, and I was quite willing to serve that role. I had a calendar that I kept on my coffee table that for our social schedule, and as people would die, I would write the names up in the upper corner of each month. I clipped obituaries. Every morning, the first page I read in the paper was the obituaries. Didn't want to miss anybody. You went to a funeral every week. You know you're living in strange times when you start critiquing funerals as an art form. But it was true. Gay men knew how to put on parties. They knew how to entertain. They could show you how to put on a funeral. And we did. I was on the board of Aid Atlanta at that point, and I saw a young man from Greenville, South Carolina, Jim Granger, no relation to my partner. He had moved back from California, was coming back home to die. He had gotten to Atlanta. He was hospitalized on one occasion, and I saw him on about the second time he was hospitalized. And Jim was essentially ready to throw in the towel. It doesn't happen all that often, but occasionally you have, in the psychiatric business, you have a real connection with a patient, almost on a spiritual kind of level. And I developed that connection with Jim. Got to know him very well. Got to meet his family. Had my pastor come in and meet with his family. Was there in the room when he came out to his family, and Jim told him he knew he was a disappointment, and that they hadn't expected a faggot for a son, and he just laid it all out. After he had finished, his mama said, "Don't you ever let me hear that you say that word again." And his dad kind of shook his head. "I don't understand it, but you're my son. You always will be." It was an incredible moment of reconciliation there. I got to know Jim's parents really very well. He started going to Northside with us. He became the first PWA coordinator at Aid Atlanta. As I was working with Jim, I pointed out to him, "It ain't over yet. Your script isn't out yet." And for the next 6 or 8 months, he was probably the most productive he'd ever been in his life. Eventually, he developed lymphoma. He died a really very difficult death. But according to his wishes, we stopped treatment at Piedmont. He went back to the residence, which was the over on Moreland, and we had a death watch. People were there with him. Jim was not alone. And we had his funeral at Northside, and we had the reception afterward here at Camp Merton. There was some very good stories that came out of that time as well. All of this was going on before any treatment was available. Ryan White came along. Elton John and Michael Jackson befriended him, became a national icon, and finally we got federal funding. And that's when the Ryan White funds became available federally, and Fulton County convened the HIV Planning Council, and I was on that council initially. Obviously, I had shifted ground considerably from being one of those that don't march in the streets and don't do any kind of public display to being almost a poster child. I was on the planning council for a number of years. I don't remember exactly how long. It was a fractious group, but it was also an exciting time too. Atlanta, I really have learned since then that Atlanta, in some ways, was kind of a model for HIV care delivery for the country. We didn't have some of the problems that some of the other cities had, like New York and San Francisco, which had multiple organizations doing the same thing. Part of that had to do with our size. We were good, the right size to have one organization that fed people, Project Open Hand. Jerusalem House was developed. And pretty much, while there was some overlap, there wasn't the turf battles that some cities experienced. There was an AIDS conference in Washington, D.C., and a large group of us from AIDS Atlanta went up to Washington to attend that meeting. And one of the speakers at that meeting was Michael Chernoff. Michael was a social worker working in New York, and his presentation was about grief overload. And it had not really hit full force in Atlanta yet, but that presentation was was staggering as he talked about what they were dealing with currently in New York City. And it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the same thing was going to happen with us. And yes, we encountered grief overload. Grief is a process that has to occur over time. You have the various steps of grieving and mourning and finally acceptance. But it takes time for that to occur. Before you could even begin to grieve one loss, there was another one. And they just stacked up on top of one another. It was very much a cumulative process. What you found yourself doing was becoming numb. You were overwhelmed. You could not. There was really no time to mourn. There was too much fucking work to do, and there was no time to be able to really process what was happening. And then you would find there wouldn't be any tears. You'd seem stoic, and then you'd be in church one Sunday, and a hymn would hit you, and the tears would start to flow. You'd be in the car, listening to the radio, and a song would come on, totally unexpectedly, and it would break through. You never knew when it was going to happen. You'd be in a movie, some tender tearjerker, and it would come. But yeah, grief overload was a major problem. We would have 6 or 8 people would meet in someone's home, Friday night, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, for a very intensive program of dealing with the issues of grief. And we began to do those. You couldn't deal with everybody, but you would. We were beginning to address the grief problem. Jerusalem House, when they had their first facility on Briarcliff, they were having enormous losses among their patient population. Positive Impact partnered with them. We recruited a team of psychologists that worked with their staff to help them deal with the issues of loss and grieving. We had to be creative. We had to make this up because there wasn't any roadmap for how to do this. We made it all up as we went along. At some point during the late 80s, the Ford Foundation issued some grants to community foundations around the country There were matching grants. I think it was $200,000 a year over 2 years. The local community had to raise a like amount, and the AIDS Fund was created. Alicia Phillip was and still is the executive director at the foundation, and she recruited a broad coalition of people, a lot of corporate heavies, and brought them to the table. And I was one of the first. I was involved in that first group. She was able to get the corporate support to meet the match, and we started making grants to agencies for providing HIV services. United Way also was beginning to make AIDS grants. They had the checkoff for their for people that were donating to United Way. They had the combined federal campaign that was had a checkoff. So they partnered with the Metropolitan Foundation and created the AIDS Partnership Fund. That avoided overlap. You had one set of staff and one committee that did the work for both agencies. Both boards had to sign off on our recommendation, but that was pretty much a pro forma. And we had anywhere $500,000-$600,000 every year to distribute. The Elton John AIDS Foundation provided $50,000 a year. As I pointed out, people had parties. Stosh Ostrow, who was a general practice physician here in Atlanta, had a big Christmas party every year, and it was understood that at the entrance there was a basket, and you were expected to make a donation. I mean, they wouldn't throw you out if you didn't, but there were all kinds of ways like that. We had, some people were willing to be more out and open in their involvement than others were. There were a lot of gay men in Atlanta that were afraid to write a check to Aid Atlanta. I think they were being overly paranoid, but that was the situation. Alan Jones, who was a good friend of mine. In fact, Alan was the man that introduced me to Atlanta back in 1976. Alan had access to a lot of the A-gays in Atlanta. He organized what was called Helping Hands. It was a monthly dinner down at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, business attire, and you could make your donation to Helping Hands, which then funneled the money into Aid Atlanta. It seems sad that even at that time, people were really fearful about there being any hint that they might be gay or supporting a gay cause. Other people were willing to be more open about it. We had a lot of friends in the straight community. There were a lot of gay men that knew well-heeled straight women. The prime moving force behind Jerusalem House was the Junior League, but it was the decorators and the gay men that were involved with those women that brought the issue to them. I was on the partnership fund when Jerusalem House made its first request. In fact, the biggest grant we ever made was $125,000 to get Jerusalem House launched. But those women brought together their decorators and they decorated those that house on Briarcliff. It was a show place, and it was all done free. But there were a lot of people, a lot of straight friends out in the community that had lost gay friends. They had their own set of losses, and they were quite willing to help. And it was a matter of being able to access those resources and to bring them to the table.